My name is Lawrence Bennett, and the night I chose my wife over my son began with a birthday cake. Looking back now, I sometimes wish the evening had ended before dessert. It would have saved everyone a great deal of pain. But life rarely gives us that choice. The truth has a way of arriving, whether we're ready for it or not. My wife May had just turned 68 years old. We had been married for 43 years. 43 years of ordinary moments. Difficult seasons, laughter, arguments, family vacations, financial struggles, and everything else that makes up a real marriage. She wasn't just my wife, she was my best friend. The person who stood beside me when my business nearly failed in the early years. The woman who sat beside hospital beds when my parents passed away. The mother who spent countless sleepless nights raising our son Christopher. If there was one thing I wanted that evening, it was for May to feel loved. The dining room looked beautiful. Flowers covered the center of the table. Candles flickered softly near the windows. Family photographs decorated one wall. May had spent the afternoon smiling more than she had in months. That alone made the effort worthwhile. Christopher arrived shortly after 6 o'clock with his wife Jessica and their 6-year-old daughter Lily. At first everything seemed normal. Christopher hugged his mother. Lily handed her grandmother a handmade birthday card. Even Jessica appeared pleasant. That should have been my first warning. Jessica was rarely pleasant unless she wanted something. Over the years I had learned to tolerate her behavior for Christopher's sake. She criticized restaurants, complained about gifts, started arguments over insignificant details. Somehow every gathering eventually became about Jessica's feelings, Jessica's frustrations, or Jessica's demands. Yet even I didn't expect what happened that night. Dinner began peacefully. People laughed. Stories were shared. Lily talked excitedly about school. May looked happier than she had looked in weeks. Then Jessica noticed the serving platter. Of all the things in the room, it was a serving platter that started the disaster. The platter had belonged to May's mother. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't valuable. It simply carried sentimental meaning. Jessica stared at it for several seconds. "That's interesting," she said. Her tone immediately made me uncomfortable. May smiled politely. "It belonged to my mother." Jessica nodded slowly. I figured. Then she laughed. Not kindly. "Honestly, it looks pretty outdated." The room became quiet. Not completely silent. Just uncomfortable. Christopher immediately glanced at his plate. A habit I had noticed whenever Jessica crossed a line. He never challenged her. He simply waited for other people to absorb the damage. May attempted to change the subject. Unfortunately, Jessica wasn't finished. "You know," she continued, "sometimes holding on to old things prevents people from moving forward." I felt irritation building in my chest. "It's a family keepsake," I said. Jessica shrugged. "It's just a plate." May's smile disappeared. The conversation stumbled forward awkwardly for several minutes. Then Jessica complained about the food. Then the seating arrangement. Then the dessert. By 8 o'clock, the atmosphere felt completely different from the celebration May deserved. Finally, May stood and reached for one of the serving dishes. What happened next lasted less than 3 seconds. Jessica stood abruptly at the same moment. There was a sharp movement, an angry voice. Then a loud crash. May slammed backward into the dining room wall. The serving dish shattered across the floor. For a moment, nobody moved. Lily began crying immediately. Christopher jumped to his feet. I rushed toward May. Her shoulder struck the wall hard enough to leave a visible mark. She looked shocked. More shocked than injured, as though her mind couldn't fully process what had just happened. "What the hell happened?" I demanded. Jessica's face was red with anger. She walked into me. The lie arrived so quickly it almost impressed me. I looked directly at Christopher. Surely he had seen it. Surely he would say something. Instead, my son hesitated. Then he delivered the sentence that changed everything. "Dad, it was probably just an accident." The room became silent. Completely silent. I stared at him. Then at Jessica. Then at my wife, who was still holding her injured shoulder. Something inside me broke. "Get out." Nobody moved. "Dad," Christopher started. "Get out of my house." My voice was louder this time. Harder. Colder. Jessica looked offended. Christopher looked stunned. Lily continued crying. I didn't care. Not anymore. 10 minutes later, their car disappeared down the street. May sat quietly in the living room while I cleaned broken pieces of glass from the dining room floor. When the house finally became silent again, I walked into my office and opened the bottom drawer of an old filing cabinet. Buried beneath years of paperwork sat a thick folder Christopher had completely forgotten about. I stared at it for several seconds before opening the cover, and as I began reading the first page, I realized the events of that evening were about to cost my son far more than a family argument. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw May hitting the wall. Not falling, not stumbling, hitting it. There is a difference. Accidents leave confusion behind. What happened in my dining room left fear. Around midnight, I found May sitting alone at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of tea she hadn't touched. The bruise on her shoulder was already beginning to darken. You should get some sleep, I told her gently. She nodded but didn't move. Jessica didn't mean to do it, she said quietly. I stared at her in disbelief. May. She looked down. I don't want Christopher to lose his family because of me. Those words broke my heart more than the shove itself. Because even now, she was trying to protect the people who had hurt her. I sat beside her and took her hand. You didn't do this. She didn't answer. Neither of us truly slept that night. The next morning, after May finally went upstairs, I returned to my office and opened the folder I had taken from the filing cabinet. Christopher Property Agreement. The document was 6 years old. I remembered the day we signed it. Christopher and Jessica were newly married and desperate to buy a home. Housing prices were rising faster than they could save. Banks weren't interested in their financial history. Their credit wasn't terrible, but it wasn't strong enough either. So I stepped in. I purchased the house myself and created a lease-to-own agreement that would allow them to build toward ownership over time. At least that was the plan. Christopher believed he was building equity. Jessica told everyone they owned the house. Neither of them ever paid much attention to the details. I did. Slowly, I turned pages until I reached the section I was looking for. Section 7, Paragraph C. The language was straightforward. The agreement could be terminated with 30 days written notice if the conduct of the occupants created a threat to the safety or well-being of members of my family. At the time, it seemed like a precaution, a legal safety net, something I would never actually need. Now I found myself reading it 3 times, then 4. Finally, I picked up my phone and called Sharon Kuwata. Sharon had been my attorney for nearly 15 years. She answered before the second ring. Lawrence, everything all right? I looked toward the staircase where May was resting. No. Sharon immediately became serious. What happened? I told her everything. The argument, the platter, the shove, the wall, the bruise. Most importantly, Christopher standing there and calling it an accident. When I finished, Sharon remained silent for several seconds. Is May okay? Physically, yes. Another pause. Then Sharon asked the question I had been avoiding. What do you want to do? My eyes dropped to the contract sitting open on my desk. I want to invoke paragraph C. The silence on the other end became noticeably heavier. Lawrence, you understand what that means. I did, more than she realized. Christopher loses the house. Yes. Jessica loses the house. Yes. And your relationship with your son may never recover. I closed my eyes briefly. For a moment, I thought about Christopher as a child. Little league games, school graduations, family vacations. Every memory fought against the decision in front of me. Then I remembered May's trembling hands, the fear in her eyes, the bruise forming on her shoulder. Prepare the notice. Sharon exhaled slowly. Are you sure? I looked again at the contract. Then at the staircase. Then at the life I had promised to build with the woman upstairs. I'm sure. After a long pause, Sharon finally spoke. All right. I'll have the termination notice ready Monday morning. I thanked her and ended the call. Then I sat alone in my office staring at the contract. Somewhere across town, Christopher probably believed the worst part of the evening was already over. He had no idea that within 48 hours, everything he thought he owned would begin slipping away. Monday morning arrived with an uncomfortable sense of inevitability. For the first time in years, I found myself dreading the sound of my phone. Not because I feared bad news, because I already knew it was coming. Sharon emailed the termination notice shortly after 8 o'clock. I reviewed every page carefully before signing. Once the document left my inbox, there was no taking it back. No pretending the previous week had never happened. No returning to the version of our family that existed before May hit that wall. Around 11 that morning, a courier delivered the notice to Christopher's house. I know the exact time because Christopher called me 22 minutes later. The moment I saw his name appear on my screen, I knew he had opened the envelope. I let the phone ring twice before answering. "Dad, what is this?" There was no greeting, no small talk. Just panic, pure panic. I leaned back in my chair. "You received the notice. You're terminating the agreement?" His voice cracked slightly. "Dad, there has to be some mistake." I looked through the office window toward the backyard. "There isn't." Silence. Then another voice appeared in the background. "Jessica." Even through the phone, I could hear the anger in her tone. Christopher lowered his voice. "Dad, please, let's talk about this." I had wanted to talk 2 nights earlier, before the lies, before the excuses, before my son looked at his injured mother and called violence an accident. "We're talking now." Christopher exhaled sharply. "You're overreacting." The words settled over me like ice water. Not because they surprised me, because they confirmed everything I feared. Even now, he still didn't understand. "Your mother was hurt. Jessica didn't mean to." I ended the sentence for him. "That's not what I asked." Silence followed. For several seconds, Christopher had no answer. Then Jessica grabbed the phone. I could practically feel it happen. "Lawrence, this is ridiculous." There it was. Not concern, not remorse, not accountability. Just outrage that consequences had finally arrived. "You can't take away our house because of one misunderstanding." Our house. The phrase almost made me laugh. "Jessica, your misunderstanding left a bruise on my wife's shoulder." She bumped into the wall. The lie came so naturally that I wondered how many times she had repeated it already. I heard Christopher say something quietly in the background. Jessica ignored him. "You're destroying Lily's stability over family drama." That sentence revealed more than she intended. Not once did she ask how May was feeling. Not once did she apologize. The only thing she cared about was losing the house. I ended the call shortly afterward. There was nothing left to discuss. The second call came that evening. The third arrived the next morning. By Wednesday, Christopher had called 11 times. Some messages were angry, others desperate. One blamed me entirely, another blamed Jessica. A few simply begged me to reconsider. I listened to every voicemail, without responding. Then Thursday afternoon, a different message arrived. This one wasn't from Christopher. It was from May. She stood quietly beside my desk, holding her phone. "Listen to this." I pressed play. Christopher's voice filled the room. "Mom, please talk to Dad. He's not listening to me." A pause. "Tell him we're sorry." Another pause. Then the sentence that mattered most. "We can't afford to lose this house." Not "we can't afford to lose our family." Not "we're sorry for what happened." Not "how is your shoulder?" The house. May slowly lowered the phone. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, she whispered, "I think that's the first honest thing he said." Later that evening, as I locked the front door before bed, I noticed a familiar vehicle parked across the street. Jessica's car. The engine was off. The headlights were dark. Yet someone was sitting inside watching the house. And for the first time since the notice was delivered, I realized they weren't preparing to accept the consequences. They were preparing to fight them. The next morning I checked the street before opening the curtains. Jessica's car was gone. For a brief moment I allowed myself to believe she had finally accepted reality. I should have known better. People like Jessica rarely accept consequences. They look for ways around them. Around noon, May left the house for her weekly volunteer shift at the church thrift store. She insisted on going despite everything that had happened. "I don't want to hide in my own life," she told me. I admired her courage. I also worried it would be used against her. 2 hours later, my phone rang. The moment I saw May's name, I answered. "Everything okay?" Silence. Not complete silence. Breathing. Shaky breathing. My stomach immediately tightened. May? Her voice finally emerged. Small. Unsteady. She's here. I was already grabbing my keys. Jessica? Yes. The call ended less than 30 seconds later. I reached the thrift store in under 10 minutes. Jessica was standing outside near the parking lot when I arrived. The moment she saw me, she smiled. Not warmly. Strategically. The same smile salespeople use before asking for something expensive. May stood near the entrance with 2 volunteers beside her. She looked pale, relieved to see me. Frightened, too. That combination made my anger rise instantly. What are you doing here? I asked. Jessica placed a hand dramatically against her chest. I came to apologize. The performance was impressive. If I hadn't known her, I might have believed it. Then apologize and leave. Jessica ignored that completely. Instead, she turned toward May. I've been feeling terrible. May said nothing. Jessica continued. The whole thing got blown out of proportion. There it was, not even 30 seconds into the conversation. The apology already contained an excuse. I never wanted anyone to get hurt. Another excuse. We were both emotional. And there was the blame sharing. Jessica wasn't apologizing. She was rewriting history. The volunteers standing nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances. Even strangers could see what was happening. May folded her arms. You pushed me. Jessica immediately shook her head. I bumped into you. The anger inside me sharpened. Not because she denied it. Because she denied it while pretending to apologize. Leave. Jessica's smile disappeared. Lawrence, this doesn't concern you. The statement actually stunned me. I looked at my wife standing there with a fading bruise on her shoulder, then back at Jessica. It concerns me more than anyone else. For a moment, I thought she might finally back down. Instead, she stepped closer to May. You know this isn't fair. May visibly flinched. That single reaction changed everything, because it wasn't anger. It wasn't annoyance. It was fear, real fear, the kind that appears when someone no longer feels safe. I moved between them immediately. We're done. Jessica rolled her eyes. You're acting like I'm dangerous. Nobody answered. The silence itself was the answer. Her expression hardened. You're really going to destroy Christopher's life over this? Again, not one question about May. Not 1 ounce of accountability. Only the house. The agreement. The consequences. I pulled out my phone. Leave now. She crossed her arms. Or what? Or, the next conversation happens through attorneys and a restraining order. For the first time, uncertainty appeared in her face. Just a flicker, but it was there. Jessica stared at me for several seconds before turning toward her car. The tires squealed slightly as she drove away. Afterward, I helped May into the passenger seat of our car. She remained quiet during most of the drive home. Then, halfway there, she finally spoke. She wasn't there to apologize. I know. May stared out the window. She was there to see if she could still control the situation. Neither of us spoke again until we reached home. That evening, just as I finished updating Sharon about what happened, another phone call arrived. This one came from Patricia Reynolds, Jessica's older sister. The moment I answered, she got straight to the point. Lawrence, she said quietly, there's something you need to know. Her voice shook slightly. This isn't the first time Jessica has become violent. I expected Patricia Reynolds to tell me about an old argument, maybe a fight at a family gathering, something embarrassing but manageable. Instead, her phone call changed the way I viewed my son forever. After May went to bed, I sat alone in my office and called Patricia back. She answered immediately, as though she had been waiting beside the phone. Thank you for calling, she said quietly. Her voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had spent years keeping a secret she no longer wanted to carry. What did you mean when you said Jessica had been violent before? For several seconds, Patricia didn't answer. Then she sighed. Jessica has always had a temper. That wasn't surprising. How bad? Another pause. Bad enough that our parents stopped inviting her to certain family events. My grip tightened around the phone. Patricia began describing a pattern that stretched back years. Explosive arguments, broken dishes, damaged furniture, friendships destroyed after minor disagreements. Several romantic relationships that ended with accusations, screaming matches, and sometimes physical confrontations. None of it sounded healthy. All of it sounded familiar. "Christopher knows this?" I asked. Patricia laughed bitterly. "Christopher knows more than anyone." The room became silent. Patricia then told me something I wasn't prepared to hear. About 3 years earlier, Jessica had shoved Christopher during an argument in their kitchen, hard enough for him to hit a countertop. He wasn't seriously injured, but the incident happened. There had been apologies afterward, tears, promises, excuses. The same cycle repeated several times. "Why didn't he leave?" I asked. Patricia didn't hesitate. "Because Christopher always believed he could manage her." I leaned back slowly in my chair. Manage her, control her, fix her. The words sounded painfully familiar. Then Patricia said something that bothered me even more. Jessica wasn't the only problem. My stomach tightened immediately. "What do you mean?" Patricia hesitated. For the first time during the conversation, she sounded uncomfortable. "Christopher has a habit." I waited. He knows exactly which buttons to push. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything else she had said. Patricia explained that Christopher often provoked arguments when he wanted leverage. He would make passive-aggressive comments, bring up sensitive subjects, corner people emotionally until they reacted. Then he would step back and let someone else take the blame for the explosion. "You're saying he does it on purpose?" Patricia sighed. "I'm saying he's been doing it since college." I stared at the desk in front of me. Suddenly, memories began resurfacing. Small things I had ignored over the years. Jessica exploding during family dinners. Christopher sitting quietly while everyone focused on her behavior. Arguments that seemed to start from nowhere. Situations where Christopher somehow emerged, looking reasonable while everyone else looked unstable. For the first time, I wondered what happened immediately before May hit that wall. What had been said? What had been done? What part of the story was missing? Patricia wasn't finished. "Lawrence, I don't think Christopher expected Jessica to push May." "But?" I asked. "I think he expected a scene." The words landed hard, because they made sense. Too much sense. Christopher knew Jessica's temper. He knew family gatherings were dangerous territory. Yet he brought her anyway. Then, when everything collapsed, his first concern wasn't his mother. It was the house, the agreement, the consequences. After the call ended, I sat alone for nearly an hour thinking. The easiest version of this story had been simple. Jessica was the villain. Christopher was trapped. My family was a victim of her behavior. But the truth looked far more complicated, far uglier. Jessica might have lit the match. Yet Christopher had spent years pouring gasoline around every room in the house. The next morning, while sorting through old documents connected to the property agreement, I found something unexpected. Several emails Christopher had sent me over the years regarding refinancing, ownership transfers, and accelerated equity options. At first glance, they seemed harmless. Then I noticed a pattern. Every message appeared shortly after a major argument with Jessica, and for the first time I began wondering whether my son had been using chaos as a negotiation strategy all along. The first letter from Christopher's attorney arrived the following Tuesday. Sharon called me before I even opened the envelope. "Don't panic when you read it," she said. "That's usually a good sign." I almost laughed. Almost. The letter itself was exactly what Sharon expected. Formal language. Aggressive tone. Several claims suggesting the termination of the property agreement was unfair, unreasonable, and potentially unenforceable. Christopher wasn't asking for mercy anymore. He was preparing for a fight. I sat at my desk and read every page carefully. Then I read it again. Most of the argument relied on one assumption, that a court would view the incident involving May as an isolated family dispute, rather than a legitimate safety concern. Unfortunately for Christopher, the bruise on my wife's shoulder told a different story. Sharon arrived later that afternoon carrying a stack of documents thicker than the demand letter itself. "Good news," she said, as she dropped the files onto my desk. "The contract is solid." For the first time all week, I felt a small sense of relief. Sharon reviewed the agreement line by line. Section 7C had been written specifically to protect family members from dangerous behavior. More importantly, the language was broad enough to include threats, intimidation, and physical harm. Jessica's actions fit the clause perfectly. Can they challenge it? I asked. Of course. Sharon shrugged. Anyone can challenge anything. Then she smiled slightly. Winning is a different matter. Over the next several days, the conflict intensified. Emails, phone calls, legal notices. Every communication seemed more desperate than the last. Christopher's attorney requested mediation. Sharon declined. Christopher requested additional time. Sharon offered only what the contract required. Every path led to the same destination: move out. Then the voicemails started arriving again. Some came late at night. Others arrived before sunrise. I listened to every one of them. In the beginning, Christopher sounded angry, then frustrated, then frightened. By the second week, the anger was mostly gone. One message stayed with me. Dad, please. Lily doesn't deserve this. I replayed that voicemail 3 times. Not because it changed my mind, because it reminded me who was truly paying the price for her parents' decisions. Even May cried after hearing it. I hate this, she admitted one evening. I know. I don't want Lily to suffer. Neither did I. But protecting Lily and protecting May were no longer the same thing. That was the tragedy. Late Friday afternoon, I returned home after meeting with Sharon. As I entered the garage, I noticed someone standing near the workbench. For a split second, my heart jumped. Then I recognized him. Christopher. He looked terrible, exhausted, unshaven, older than I remembered. He had clearly been waiting a long time. Neither of us spoke immediately. The silence between us felt heavier than any argument we had ever shared. Finally, Christopher stepped forward. His eyes were red. His shoulders slumped. For the first time since this nightmare began, he didn't look angry. He looked defeated. Dad, he said quietly, please just hear me out. And standing there in the garage where I had taught him how to ride a bicycle, change a tire, and build a bookshelf, I realized this conversation was going to change everything. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Christopher stood in the garage, looking like a man who hadn't slept in days. The sight should have made me feel sorry for him. Part of me did. Another part remembered May flinching when Jessica stepped toward her in that church parking lot. You shouldn't be here, I finally said. Christopher laughed weakly. Probably not. His voice sounded tired, defeated, different. I waited. Eventually, he leaned against the workbench and rubbed his face with both hands. I don't know what to do anymore. That sentence caught my attention because it was the first honest thing I had heard from him in weeks. I folded my arms and remained silent. Christopher looked down at the concrete floor. You were right about Jessica. The words hung in the air between us. A little late for that. He nodded slowly. I know. Another long silence followed. Then the story began spilling out. Not all at once, piece by piece. Jessica's temper had become worse over the last several years. The arguments were more frequent, the explosions more intense, the apologies shorter. According to Christopher, he spent years convincing himself things would improve. Every broken promise became another reason to wait a little longer. Every apology became another excuse. Why? I asked. Christopher stared at the floor. Because leaving felt like failure. I understood that answer more than I wanted to admit. Then he told me about Lily. About the nights she hid in her room during arguments. About the mornings when she pretended not to hear her parents fighting. About the growing fear that she was starting to believe this was what marriage looked like. For the first time during the conversation, I saw genuine shame in my son's eyes. I should have left years ago. Yes, I replied. He nodded. No argument. No excuses. Just acceptance. Then he took a deep breath. I'm filing for divorce. The garage fell silent. Part of me felt relief. Another part felt sadness. Not because the marriage was ending, because of how much damage had already been done before he reached that decision. When? I asked. Next week. Christopher looked directly at me for the first time. I mean it this time. The words sounded sincere. They probably were. Unfortunately, sincerity doesn't erase consequences. Then the conversation shifted. Slowly at first, almost carefully. Christopher began talking about rebuilding his life, starting over, protecting Lily, creating stability. Everything sounded reasonable, sensible even, until he finally reached the real reason he came. Dad. There it was. The word hung in the air. If Jessica is gone. I closed my eyes briefly. Here we go. Maybe we can work something out with the house. Silence. Complete silence. Christopher immediately looked away. Because he knew. Deep down, he already knew. The problem wasn't that he wanted another chance. The problem was that he still viewed the house as part of the solution. After everything. After May. After the lawyers. After the lies. After the violence. He still couldn't separate his future from that property. You came here for the house. Christopher shook his head immediately. No. Then he hesitated. Just long enough. Not just for the house. The correction said everything. I stared at him for several seconds. Do you know what hurts the most? He didn't answer. Not Jessica. His eyes lifted. Not even the shove. The garage became completely silent. It's that every conversation eventually comes back to this house. Christopher looked as though I had slapped him, because he knew it was true. The divorce was real. His fear was real. His regret was real. But mixed inside all of it was something else. Self-interest. The same self-interest that kept appearing every time consequences arrived. Finally, I shook my head. The agreement stands. Christopher's face fell immediately. Dad. No. My voice echoed through the garage. Your mother was hurt. Everything that happened afterward came from that moment. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then something inside Christopher snapped. Anger replaced desperation. Fine. He took a step backward. Keep the house. Another step. Keep all of it. Then he pointed directly at me. But don't pretend you're doing this for Lily. The words hit harder than he intended. Not because they were true, because he wanted them to be. Moments later, he stormed out of the garage and disappeared down the driveway. I stood there listening to his car engine fade into the distance. And for the first time, I realized losing the house might not be the worst thing my son was about to lose. The week after my conversation with Christopher felt strangely quiet. Too quiet. Sharon often said that silence during legal disputes usually meant someone was planning their next move. As it turned out, she was right. 3 days after Christopher stormed out of my garage, May noticed a familiar vehicle parked near the entrance of our neighborhood. At first, she didn't mention it. Then she saw it again the following morning. And again 2 days later. By the fourth sighting, neither of us believed it was a coincidence. Jessica was watching the house. The realization unsettled May more than she wanted to admit. She stopped taking her evening walks. She started checking the locks twice before bed. Once, I even caught her looking through the front curtains after hearing a car door close outside. Seeing that kind of fear in my wife made something inside me harden. This was no longer about a property agreement. It was no longer about family conflict. It was about safety. The situation escalated the following Saturday. May and I had just finished lunch at a small cafe near the church when Jessica appeared without warning. One moment we were discussing weekend plans. The next moment she was standing beside our table. Her face looked tired, angry, desperate. You did this, she said immediately. Several nearby customers turned to look. I stood up before May could respond. Jessica, leave. She ignored me completely. Her eyes remained fixed on May. You ruined everything. The accusation was so absurd it almost took my breath away. May gripped the edge of the table but said nothing. Jessica stepped closer. Christopher filed the papers. The divorce. For a brief second, genuine pain crossed her face. Then it disappeared beneath anger. You turned him against me. That was enough. I pulled out my phone and told her I was calling the police. Instead of backing away, Jessica laughed. Not because she found anything funny. Because she no longer cared how she appeared. That frightened me more than shouting would have. Fortunately, the cafe manager intervened and asked her to leave. Jessica eventually walked away before officers arrived, but the damage had already been done. 2 days later, Sharon filed paperwork requesting a restraining order. The moment I described the repeated surveillance, the confrontation at the cafe, and May's growing fear, Sharon didn't hesitate. "We're past second chances," she told me. "Now we're documenting patterns." Meanwhile, Christopher's situation continued deteriorating. Through mutual friends, I learned that the divorce proceedings were becoming uglier by the day. Arguments, threats, accusations, financial disputes. Everything seemed to be collapsing simultaneously. Yet despite all the chaos, one date continued approaching with relentless certainty: move-out day. The final deadline established in the termination notice was now less than 2 weeks away. Sharon's office confirmed there would be no extensions, no delays, no renegotiations. For the first time since this nightmare began, the consequences were no longer theoretical. They were arriving, fast. Late one evening, I stepped outside to bring in the mail. As I reached the front porch, I noticed a folded piece of paper tucked beneath the doormat. No envelope, no name, just a single handwritten sentence. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Jessica's. The message contained only 7 words. "If I lose everything, everyone loses something." I stood there staring at the note for several seconds. Then, I carried it directly inside and placed it in Sharon's evidence folder. Because at that moment, I realized the countdown to move-out day wasn't the only clock running anymore. Move-out day arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. Somehow that felt appropriate. For months, everyone had been pretending consequences were negotiable. That morning proved they weren't. I woke before sunrise and sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee, while May slept upstairs. Neither of us had mentioned the date for several days. We didn't need to. It hung over the house like a storm cloud. Around 8 o'clock, Sharon called to confirm what we already knew. The property had been surrendered. The agreement was officially terminated. Christopher and Jessica were no longer residents of the home. Just like that, 6 years of assumptions disappeared. I wish I could say I felt victorious. I didn't. I felt tired. A few hours later, Patricia called. Her voice sounded exhausted. "They're at a motel." I closed my eyes. For all my anger, hearing those words still hurt. Christopher had grown up in a stable home. Now he was living in a motel with his daughter while his marriage collapsed around him. No father celebrates something like that. Patricia continued. "Jessica is making everything worse." That didn't surprise me. According to Patricia, the divorce had become a weapon. One day, Jessica threatened to take Lily and leave the state. The next day, she demanded reconciliation. Then she accused Christopher of abandoning the family. Every conversation seemed designed to create chaos. Every promise came attached to conditions. Every apology led to another argument. It was the same cycle she had used for years. The difference was that Christopher could no longer pretend not to see it. A week later, he called me, not to argue, not to negotiate, just to talk. For nearly 20 minutes, I listened while my son described the reality of his new life. Motel rooms, legal bills, custody disputes, constant uncertainty. He sounded older than his years, smaller somehow. "I should have listened," he admitted quietly. I didn't answer immediately, because part of me wanted to hear those words. Another part hated the fact that they arrived so late. "Maybe," I finally said. Silence followed. Then Christopher surprised me. "You know what the worst part is?" I waited. "It isn't losing the house." That answer caught my attention. "It's realizing how many times I chose the easier lie." The room became silent. Every time Jessica crossed a line, I told myself it wasn't that bad. Another pause. Every time Mom got hurt, embarrassed, or disrespected, I told myself things would get better. He laughed bitterly. I spent years waiting for a different ending. For the first time in months, I heard genuine accountability in his voice. No excuses, no blame shifting, just regret. Unfortunately, regret doesn't reverse damage. The following month, I made a decision regarding the property. The house had become a symbol of too many painful things. Broken trust, manipulation, excuses, family conflict. Every room carried reminders of what had happened. So I sold it. Not because I needed the money, because I needed the chapter to end. When the sale closed, Sharon asked the obvious question. What are you going to do with the proceeds? I looked out the office window for a long moment before answering. For months, everyone had assumed this story was about ownership, about property, about money. They were wrong. It had always been about choices, and now it was time to make one of my own, a decision that would surprise Christopher, shock Jessica, and ensure that the house which nearly destroyed my family would never control another person's life again. When the sale of the house finally closed, Sharon scheduled a meeting to review the paperwork. The proceeds were substantial, more than enough to change someone's life. In fact, that had been the problem from the beginning. Too many people had spent the last several months looking at that property and seeing opportunity instead of responsibility. I had no intention of making the same mistake. So, Sharon asked as she closed the final folder, "What do you want to do with the money?" I already knew the answer. The decision had been made long before the paperwork was complete. "I want to donate it." Sharon blinked. "All of it? Every dollar?" For a moment, she simply stared at me. Then she smiled. Not because she was surprised, because she understood. A few weeks later, the funds were transferred to several organizations supporting women and families escaping domestic abuse, shelters, counseling programs, legal aid services, the kind of places May had quietly volunteered with for years. The house that nearly destroyed my family would now help protect others from suffering the same kind of pain. For the first time since this nightmare began, that felt right. News of the donation spread through the family quickly. Christopher called 2 days later. I expected anger, maybe disappointment. Instead, I heard something entirely different. Acceptance. I heard about the money. "You did." A short silence followed. I guess I always thought there would be something left. His honesty caught me off guard. "I know." Another pause. Then he laughed softly. "That's probably part of the problem." We talked for nearly an hour that day. Not about property, not about contracts, not about blame, just life, Lily, work, the future. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was a beginning. Sometimes that's enough. Over the following year, Christopher's divorce became final. The custody arrangement gave him regular time with Lily, and for the first time in years, he started building a relationship with his daughter that wasn't constantly overshadowed by conflict. It wasn't easy. Growth rarely is. But he kept showing up, week after week, month after month. Eventually, Lily stopped looking nervous every time her parents were in the same room. That alone felt like progress. As for Jessica, history repeated itself. Relationships came and went. Jobs changed. Conflicts followed. According to Patricia, very little about her life truly changed, because very little about Jessica changed. Some people spend years running from consequences without ever learning from them. May, on the other hand, slowly reclaimed the peace that had been stolen from her. The fear disappeared first, then the tension, then the habit of checking windows and door locks before bed. One evening, nearly 18 months after her birthday party, we sat together on the back porch watching the sunset, the same way we had done hundreds of times before. "Do you regret it?" she asked quietly. I knew exactly what she meant. The contract, the house, Christopher, everything. I thought about the question for a long time. Then I shook my head. No. May looked at me carefully. Even after everything we lost, I reached for her hand. The same hand I had held for more than 4 decades. "We didn't lose everything." Her eyes softened. Mine probably did too. Because the truth was simple. I had lost the illusion that love alone can fix people. I had lost the belief that protecting someone from consequences is the same thing as helping them. But I hadn't lost my wife. I hadn't lost my values. And I hadn't lost the ability to choose what was right when it mattered most. If I had done nothing, Christopher would have learned that excuses are enough. Jessica would have learned that intimidation works. May would have learned that her safety mattered less than keeping the peace. I couldn't allow that. Looking back now, I understand something I didn't understand then. The hardest choices are rarely about choosing between right and wrong. They're about choosing which loss you can live with. I chose my wife over my son. I lost more than I ever expected. But if I had to make that decision again tomorrow, knowing everything I know now, I would choose her again.